And that's why for each one of us, I want to hide under the righteousness of Christ. I want the forgiveness that God gives me through what Jesus did, so that when I come back, I and my standing will be not in my works or my righteousness, but in my relationships with Jesus, my Savior. In Revelation 19, we get a picture that's very specific of the Lord's return at the end of time. Follow along as I read and see the difference between Jesus calling the children to himself and the righteous judge. I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. On his robe and on his thigh has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So at this point, I have no idea how you used to think about God, but here's what you got to know. He's way bigger, totally in control, and he is awesome, and he causes us to surrender and bow because he is the one. But here's what I want you to get. As high, holy, and exalted as God is, the sovereignty of God is one of the greatest comforts in all the world. So I've kind of given you the facts. I've given you the basis. When God chose in the very first book of the Bible to handle one of the most difficult things to understand, how could a good God allow evil and suffering, and how does all that fit together? He did it in the very first book. The last way, and I think the most encouraging, at least for me, that God demonstrates and reveals his sovereignty is through redeeming the pain in our lives. It's when he takes things that were meant for evil and he turns them around and makes them good. In the book of Genesis, you have the core doctrines, all the major ones. So you have the Creator, and then you have the fall, the reason for sin and evil. Then you have a flood, you have initial judgment. Then you have a new race, and you have God choosing Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob. And you have this family line that God's going to work through people. Now you've got 50 chapters, and the last 13 are about one man, Joseph. Think of that. Over 25% of the very first book of the Bible is about one man. Why? Because it answers the question of how does a good, kind God deal with the evil and injustice. And the communication is because he is sovereign and in control, he can take even the evil that's purposed toward you personally or toward a nation or toward a life, and because he's in control, he can use it for good. How many of you feel like you kind of know the story of Joseph? It'll tell me, okay, about half. I didn't grow up reading the Bible, so I didn't know much of it. So for those of us that don't know that much, here's the story. He's the youngest son. His father shows favoritism, so his brothers hate him. So his brothers put him in a pit, and they're ready to kill him. But just so happens, or sovereignly, a caravan comes by of Egyptians, and they say, why kill him when we get some money? We'll sell him to the Egyptians. They take his robe that's super duper stuff, puts it in a little bit of blood from a dead animal, takes it to dad, and say, your son's been killed. Joseph now, it's unjust. He's taken on this caravan. He gets on the auction block as a slave. And a man named Potiphar, who's sort of like the head of the secret service for Pharaoh, decides he'll buy him. So he's a slave, so he gets bought, and he goes to Potiphar's house. All along, if you would read 37 to 50, those chapters, all along, I mean, circumstances are bad, they're difficult, they're unjust, but Joseph keeps pictured on the promise God gave him. One day, remember that dream? This is what you're going to do. And so he hangs in there. Well, he has this administrative gift so that, I mean, everything he touches organizationally, it flourishes. So Potiphar goes, you know, tell you what, take over my business, take over my household, run everything, and it just flourishes. Well, he's a very good-looking young guy. And so Potiphar's wife says, you know, while my husband's at work, we could have a lot of fun. And so come on, have sex with me. And I don't know, most men would go, this sounds like a really good idea, and I got a raw deal, and this is... He goes, no, I would betray your husband, I betray the God of heaven. And so he rebuffs her. Finally, he's one day doing a little work in the house, and no one's around, and she says, come lay with me, come lay with me. And so he, again, does what most men would never do. He literally runs, and she grabs his jacket, and he leaves, and she's got the jacket, and she's humiliated. And so the husband comes home, and she says, you brought this dirty Hebrew into our house. He tried to rape me, so now he goes to prison. I mean, it goes from bad, bad, bad to worse. So now, his brothers disown him. He's sold as a slave. He ends up, things get a little bit better. Now he's in prison. He goes to prison, and his administrative gifts show up, and pretty soon the people say, you know what, why don't you run this prison? You're one of the guards, but you run this thing. Well, it goes great. And then there's a couple guys in the kingdom, a baker and a cupbearer, and apparently they both had a bad day, and so they're sentenced into the prison, and Joseph meets them, and they have a dream, each of them. And they go, oh boy, I wonder what this dream means. And Joseph says, God has given me ability to interpret dreams. And so he interprets the dreams. He says to the one guy, hey, you're going to get restored to your position. The other guy, it's going to be pretty bad. You die tomorrow. And both of them come true. And so then he says to him, hey guys, look, my brothers did this wife did this, falsely accused, I'm in prison. Amen. Remember me, right? Oh, yeah, we will. Well, they forget him. So years go by, and finally, Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh has this dream he doesn't understand, and so his sorcerers and magicians and his wise men, no one can figure it out. So he goes, hey, I got an idea. Either you come and explain the dream, tell me what I dreamed and how it happens, or I'm going to kill everybody. So this cupbearer says, this would be a good time to remember Joseph. So Joseph gets a shave, comes before the Pharaoh. Pharaoh, this is what you dreamed, 7 years of great abundance, 7 years of famine. It's going to be global. It's going to be bad. You better have a great plan, store stuff up. And Pharaoh goes, great, you're the man. So he goes from the prison to the number 2 power in the world. And then his administrative gifts, Pharaoh gets very rich. He has all this grain stockpiled. And then the famine comes. And when the famine comes, his brothers and father, there's about 70 of them, they don't have any food, and so they come to Egypt. And I'll let you read the whole story, but eventually it breaks his heart. By now, he's married an Egyptian wife. He has 2 sons that he names that really reveal the pain and the hurt and the difficulty that he's been through. And he forgives his brothers, and he realizes, in all that pain and all that difficulty, I mean, it was bad, 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 worse, terrible, and then he realized God sent me here to save the nation of Israel. So all 70 come, they get this piece of land in Goshen, and they become an incubator for the purposes of God, and they go from 70 people to 2 or 3 million in the next 300 to 400 years. It's the end of his father's life. He's dying. And the brothers, being the good, upstanding, high men of integrity they are, say something like, why Dad was here, Joseph didn't kill us, but I'm sure he's going to kill us now. And so they start, and this is, again, you can read this for yourself, but write in your notes the 50-20 principle. This is the great hope that you have, the great hope I have, because God is powerful and awesome and creator and holy and judge, but he is a kind, tender father who is sovereign. And he turns to his brothers, and I just believe that there was a tear running down his cheek. And he said, brothers, you didn't send me here, God did. What you did was wrong. But here's the word, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to bring about this present result, all these people alive. And the sovereignty of God in your life and in my life means not for everyone, but for those that are followers of Yahweh, those who are followers of Jesus, those who say, I want to follow you. The promise is, other people can mean it. They can walk out on you, mean it for evil. You can get a raw deal at work. You can get cancer in a fallen world. Terrible things can happen. But as you lean in and walk, God promises, I will use it for good. Last night, my wife, she comes to Saturday night usually and sat on the front row, and I just spontaneously thought, you know what? My wife was married as a non-Christian. A guy started selling drugs, found out that my wife that he was married to was pregnant, who was already having an affair, and he leaves to another state, and he abandons my wife. He meant it for evil. Out of her despair, her boss leads her to Christ. God meant it for good. I got to marry her. She's awesome. I got to adopt 2 little boys that are my sons that I've seen God change and grow. And why? Because God's sovereign. My hope is God's sovereign. I remember when she got cancer, and I thought, oh, God. And we have had to work hard on our marriage, but it was like, I felt like, man, after, 30-some years early, this is a great relationship. And then I remember driving her to every single appointment at Stanford. And it's just like, I remember we'd always stop at a Starbucks and get 1 oatmeal cookie and break it in half off of those treatments and have a cup of coffee. And I remember looking in the little car and going, I couldn't dream that I could love her and appreciate her if I get another month, another year, another 2 years. God can take the worst that you'll ever experience in your life, and if you lean in and if you ask him, he can bring good out of it, no matter who does it for evil. One of our teammates was in Greece in a refugee camp, and in that refugee camp, there was just tens of thousands of people fleeing from Syria and the Middle East. And this pastor who's worked with Islam for like 30 years starts praying, God, I thank you for ISIS. I thank you for ISIS. I thank you for ISIS. And it was like, what? And she looked up and said, where are you coming from? God meant it for evil. There is a movement across all of Islam of people that are completely disillusioned, that are coming to Christ in ways we never, ever dreamed. I have a friend, a young man that we just got to help, who's in Germany right now, and we email, and I'm kind of aware of what's going on. He said, Chip, you can't imagine what God is doing. They meant it for evil, but people are seeing things for what they are. What is it in your life? What is it in your life that you would say, this is hard, difficult, terrible, and you're trying to control and manipulate and make work out, in which God would say, I'm a sovereign God. Would you be willing to trust me? Would you lean in? Would you walk with me? As we close our time together, I want to challenge you to really ponder, how would God want you to respond to his sovereignty? Again, I think there's 3 very specific responses that each one of us as a follower of Christ must do. First and foremost, we need to bow before his sovereignty. It's about realizing that Jesus will come back. He's the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings. Every knee will bow. And if we don't do that willfully now in surrender and submission, the whole world will bow before him later, unwillfully. And so let me just encourage you, this idea of surrender or lordship is at the core of understanding the God of the Bible, the real God. Second, I think there's a great implication. It's to believe that everything that enters your life and mine is either decreed or allowed by God. Can you imagine? I mean, we get that from here to here. Everything that comes into your life, it's that Joseph moment where, because he understands God's sovereignty, he says they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good to bring about this present result, to save many people alive. And I know it's hard. I shared some tough stories about my life, and I know you have hard times. But you can refuse to worry. You can actually rest in the fact that though you don't understand it all, here's the comfort. God's in control. He's got your back, and he's good. And finally, this last application is a little harder for some of us. I'm not musical. I tend to be, OCD. I tend to be Mr. Activity. But I want to encourage you to behold the majesty and the sovereignty of God. Become a worshiper. Build in times of singing to him. Read the Psalms out loud. If you play an instrument, come before God and just celebrate who he is. And I think you'll find that your view of God in your heart will begin to expand. Now, here's the question that I want you all to ask. Think of a time in your life that was painful and hard, but now when you look back in the rearview mirror, God used it for good. Let's go around and share with one another. How did God take something hard or difficult or even evil and has used it for good? And if you happen to be doing this by yourself, let me encourage you to, get out a pen and just write a paragraph of that experience in your own life. You ready? Let's get started.